This is New Haven Green, where three churches stand. In the middle is Center Church. This church was founded in 1639 and pastored by John Davenport. However, during the Great Awakening, this church opposed the outpouring of the Spirit and resisted the revivals. I think it would be fascinating for Jonathan Edwards to see New Haven Green today. He might be horrified that an Anglican church established itself here on the Green. Edwards spent much of his life opposing Anglican theology. He may have been encouraged that United Church, originally known as Whitehaven Church, was formed here to embrace the awakenings, but saddened by its current theological character. While Edwards was frustrated that the original established church, what is Center Church today, opposed the revivals he fostered, Edwards benefited significantly from its ministry. It gave him a wife. Welcome to our second season in our exploration of the life and thought of Jonathan Edwards. Today we'll be exploring the life of Jonathan's wife, Sarah. I'm Christian Cuthbert, Edwards scholar and pastor, and I'll be your guide to exploring Edwards. In 1685, Reverend James Pierpont came to the pulpit in what is today Center Church. He was one of the colony's social elites that ruled New Haven in a manner similar to Stoddard's control in Northampton. He was central to securing a charter from the Connecticut legislature for the collegiate school, what is now Yale University. Reverend Pierpont was selected as the school's first rector when it was located in Saybrook. But when the school relocated to New Haven in 1718, Edwards arrived and met Reverend Pierpont's daughter, Sarah. When Edwards arrived in New Haven to complete his undergraduate studies, Sarah was a child of 8. During these years, Jonathan was known as a gruff and socially awkward teenager. In his journal, he recorded his need for greater gentleness. Quote, "A virtue which I need in higher degree is gentleness. If I had more of an air of gentleness, I should be much mended." Soon after graduation, a cultural disruption at the college would bring Jonathan and Sarah back together. In September of 1722, the rector of Yale at the time was Reverend Timothy Cutler, who caused quite the stir at commencement. After concluding his prayer, he added a line from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, "Let all God's people say Amen." Now to you and I, this addition seems insignificant, but at the time it was known as the Great Apostasy, because it signals Cutler's embrace of Anglicanism. Ben Franklin's Silence Dogood called Cutler's move popery, because this struck at the core of New England's identity. As Marston comments, Anglicanism meant opening the floodgates to Arminianism. Cutler, along with his tutors Samuel Johnson and Daniel Brown, were excused from their duties at the college, allowing Jonathan to return as tutor. This is the Pierpont home, located right on New Haven Green today as Yale's visitor center. While the college today extends away from the Green, in Edwards' day, his studies would have centered on the Green, and Sarah's house would have been daily in his view. When Edwards returned to New Haven, Jonathan had pastored a church in New York City and had grown a little less prickly. When Jonathan was 20 and Sarah 13, she had become an object of Jonathan's veneration. In a letter written near the end of his time in New York City, Jonathan wrote, "They say there is a young lady in New Haven who is beloved of that Almighty Being, who made and rules the world, and that there are certain seasons in which this great Being, in some way or other invisible, comes to her and fills her mind with exceeding sweet delight, and that she hardly cares for anything except to meditate on him, that she expects after a while to be received up where he is, to be raised out of the world and caught up into heaven, being assured that he loves her too well to let her remain at a distance from him always. There she is to dwell with him, and to be ravished with his love, favor, and delight forever. Therefore, if you present all the world before her, with the richest of its treasures, she disregards it and cares not for it. And you could not persuade her to do anything thought wrong or sinful,
if you would give her all the world, lest she should offend this great being. She is of a wonderful sweetness, calmness, and universal benevolence of mind, especially after those times in which this great God has manifested himself to her mind. She will sometimes go about singing sweetly, from place to place, and seems to be always full of joy and pleasure, and no one knows for what. She loves to be alone, and to wander in the fields and on the mountains, and seems to have someone invisible always conversing with her.
As Elizabeth Dodds describes in her book, Marriage to a Difficult Man, Jonathan and Sarah shared a, quote, sensitivity to the beauty of their surroundings. In addition to the natural world, Jonathan and Sarah shared a delight in spiritual things. As a bibliophile, Jonathan would have pleased the intellectual sensibility of Sarah's father, Reverend Pierpont. 5 years later, when Sarah was 18 years old, they became engaged. Jonathan wrote, "Patience is commonly esteemed a virtue, but in this case, I may almost regard it as a vice." In July of 1727, Sarah met her fiancé in front of her father, Reverend Pierpont, wearing a pea green satin brocade with a bold pattern to be joined in marriage. Dodds describes the newlywed couple's journey from New Haven to take up their home in Northampton along the Connecticut River, as John Adams put it, the finest ride in America. The sweet, innocent romance between Jonathan and Sarah gave way to what has been described as an uncommon union. Ola Winslow describes Sarah. By all accounts, she possessed unusual beauty and comeliness, was far more at ease in conversation than her scholarly-looking husband, and for all her solitary walks and her piety, was noted for her charm, her flashing wit, and a gay repartee of which her English cousin, Lady Mary Wortley Montague, might have been justly envious. Sarah discovered her husband woke early to begin his studies, laboring in his office all day long, often missing dinner. Dodds observed that Sarah supported Jonathan by making him, quote, sure of her steady love and that freedom to think. Samuel Hopkins wrote of Sarah's domestic administration. It was a happy circumstance that he could trust everything to the care of Mrs. Edwards with entire safety and undoubting confidence. She was a most judicious and faithful mistress of a family, habitually industrious, a sound economist, managing her household affairs with diligence and discretion. While she uniformly paid a becoming deference to her husband and treated him with entire respect, she spared no pains in conforming to his inclination and rendering everything in the family agreeable and pleasant. She accounted it her greatest glory, and therewithin she could best serve God and her generation, to be the means of promoting his usefulness and happiness. Sarah administered the home of the country parson. She hosted many visitors, and she directed the home for their 11 children. Now, this would have been a challenging task for anyone, but when you're the wife of a man driven by the glory of God, to spend upwards of 13 hours per day in his study, Sarah's domestic skills would have been tested. Samuel Hopkins describes his own experience staying with the Edwards family. Hopkins states, when I arrived there, Mr. Edwards was not at home, but I was received with great kindness by Mrs. Edwards and the family, and had encouragement that I might live there during the winter Mr. Edwards was absent on a preaching tour. I was very gloomy, and I was most of the time retired in my chamber. After some days, Mrs. Edwards came in, and said as I was now become a member of the family, at least for a season, she felt herself interested in my welfare, and she observed that I appeared gloomy and dejected. She hoped I would not think she intruded her desire to know, and asking me what the occasion of it. I told her I was in a Christless, graceless state, upon which we entered into a free conversation, and she told me that she had prayed respecting me, since I had been in the family, that she trusted I should receive light and comfort, and doubted not that God intended yet to do great things by me. Sarah ran the household and welcomed visitors as the living embodiment of Jonathan's ethic. I'm sitting on this bench outside Northampton's Forbes Library, because it has a unique connection to the home Sarah ran. At my feet, the library has embedded the front step of the Edwards homestead. The same step Jonathan, Sarah, and their 11 children and each visitor to the Edwards homestead used to enter Sarah's world. While Edwards used his front step more than any other, the other step he frequently used was this one, the step to the third meeting house here at First Churches Northampton. Despite the division of labor between Sarah and Jonathan, they were joined by their devotion to God. This harmony of spirit became evident during the awakenings. Sarah had always been spiritually sensitive, which was one of the things that brought this graceful woman and awkward boy together. While Sarah had begun to experience spiritual awakening before the arrival of Whitefield in 1740, her spiritual fervor did not reach its height until January of 1742. Sarah was used to leaning on Jonathan for spiritual guidance, taking advantage of her access to him in his office whenever her spiritual curiosity was piqued. But in January of 1742, Jonathan left on a multi-week preaching tour to promote the outpouring of the Spirit throughout New England. Edwards described the spiritual fervor in a letter to his friend Joseph Bellamy. The work of God is greater at this day in the land than it has been at any time. When Jonathan left, Samuel Buell, a tall, virile preacher, filled the Northampton pulpit. During his preaching, Sarah had been overcome with spiritual difficulties, resulting in a significant fainting spell. Sarah wrote of her experiences. My mind was so deeply impressed with the love of Christ and a sense of his immediate presence that I could with difficulty refrain from rising from my seat and leaping for joy. I continued to enjoy this intense and lively and refreshing sense of divine things, accompanied with strong emotions for nearly an hour, after which I experienced a delightful calm and peace and rest in God until I retired for the night. When Jonathan returned in February, he inquired thoroughly of Sarah's experiences. Now, it would be understandable if Jonathan was hurt or even jealous that these spiritual ecstasies arose from another's preaching. But Jonathan invited Buell to continue in Northampton, even after his return, demonstrating a pastoral maturity. Dodds presents this episode as a turning point in Sarah's life, where she, quote, stopped straining to please God and began to live in the assurance of salvation she didn't have to try to deserve. From a very young age, Jonathan put Sarah on a pedestal, raised up towards God. In his account of the awakenings of the 1740s, Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival, Jonathan presented templates for the work of God. One such template is not identified, not by name or sex, but it's widely accepted that Jonathan used his wife Sarah as this template. Jonathan writes of Sarah's experiences, extraordinary views of divine things, and religious affections, being frequently attended with very great effects on the body, nature often sinking under the weight of divine discoveries, the strength of the body taken away so as to deprive of all ability to stand or speak. Jonathan used Sarah as an illustration of how the unusual bodily effects of the awakenings were to make a spiritual impression upon the heart.
Sarah was truly an uncommon woman. We have come to the Master's House at Jonathan Edwards College, Yale, to enjoy the Badger portrait of Sarah and learn a little bit more about her. Ken Minkema, director of the Edwards Center, is nice enough to give us a tour of the portrait.
At this time, you have to think about this. Sarah is 1751. She's 41 years old. She's given birth to 11 children. Now look at her.
Yeah.
she's, slim and fair complexioned and the whole thing. Is this an idealization? Perhaps. I mean, she was described as a beautiful person, and so maybe that's just part of it. But there seems to also have been this, I don't know, this maybe inner charisma about her too that comes out in this, I think. Badger's portraits of other women of this age and this status, these matrons, are usually much more stiff and formal. They're usually not a plunging neckline. You don't have the hair flowing down like this. They're usually up in mob caps or bonnets of some kind. So it's just like, this is the country gentlewoman, right? Who's looking right at you. And she's got a little smile, and she's wearing rouge, right? Or she's got a little color
Something.
of some kind, right? She's got, again, this plunging neckline with the silk ruffle. And this dress here, this may actually be her blue chintz dress. We have a couple swaths of this dress that have survived in these little 2-inch pieces. The dress was actually displayed at an Edwards family reunion in 1870 in Stockbridge. And my speculation is that when that ended, they cut the dress up and gave it to all the participants.
Yeah, wow.
So one of the swaths is in the Beinecke Library, and the Jonathan Edwards Center has the other one.
Oh, okay.
So is this her blue chintz? It's very possible. So her self-presentation here is really fascinating and engaging in a way. I think that Jonathan's is a little more guarded, ethereal, or what have you. This is a very down-to-earth person, and yet we know that her religious experiences were, she had these series of ecstatic religious experiences throughout her life that really set her apart. And in many ways make her a radical new light, in a way that Jonathan wasn't, right? So it's a fascinating image to come down.
Yeah. So they would have set for these at in the same trip about the same time?
Probably, yeah. I suspect. It's because Sarah usually went to Boston in the springtime, around May, to take a break, do shopping, things like that, visit people. And it's possible they went together. We're not really sure of everything. I think the letter from McLaurin to Hogg is dated in November of '51, so just you have to kind of back it up a few months there at least for the something like the timing of these portraits. But they went to Boston a lot. That was kind of their hometown, in a way. I mean, obviously Sarah was born right here in New Haven.
We have returned to St. Valentine's Polish National Church on Edwards Square, where the couple's homestead stood. In her book, Dodds claims that how a child turns out is a reflection of one's mother. Therefore, in order to understand Sarah a little bit better, let's briefly examine the lives of her children.
Jonathan and Sarah's first child, Sarah, married Elihu Parsons a week and a half before her father was dismissed from Northampton in 1750. Parsons, who served as a private in the Revolutionary War, was the grandson of the Honorable Joseph Parsons, Esquire, the Country Party standard-bearer and Colonel Stoddard's political opponent. Jerusha was born in 1730 and named after Jonathan's sister, who had died in 1729. She famously cared for David Brainerd when he struggled with tuberculosis until he died in October of 1747. Despite rumors of their engagement, there is no evidence that they were ever romantically involved. She passed a few months later, in February of 1748, of a fever. After her passing, Jonathan preached the sermon, "Youth is like a flower that is cut down," praising her piety over and against the spiritual apathy of her generation. Esther was the third child of Jonathan and Sarah. While living in Stockbridge, Aaron Burr Sr., pastor of a church in Newark, visited to court Esther, and they were engaged a few days later. Aaron Sr. would become the second president of Princeton and died of a fever in 1757. His successor was Esther's father, Jonathan, who was president for a short time before getting inoculated against smallpox with his daughter Esther. Jonathan died March 22, 1758, and Esther on April 7, 1758, at the age of 26. Their children went to live with their uncle Timothy Edwards, and their son, Aaron Burr Jr., would serve as the third vice president of the United States under Jefferson, where he famously shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. Fourth child of Jonathan and Sarah, Mary, married Major Timothy Dwight III in Northampton 5 months after her father's dismissal. Major Dwight was son of Colonel Timothy Dwight, who served under Mary's great-uncle, Colonel John Stoddard. Colonel Dwight oversaw the building of Fort Dummer at Colonel Stoddard's direction, and it was there that Major Timothy Dwight III, Jonathan's eventual son-in-law, was born. Mary never forgave Northampton for driving her father away, and while she continued to attend the Northampton church, she sat in the narthex and took communion in another town. She was the mother of Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale. Fifth child of Jonathan and Sarah, Lucy, was named after her father's sister, who died just 10 days before Lucy was born. Jonathan's daughter Lucy suffered a bout of smallpox in the summer of 1757. After she recovered, she traveled to Princeton to help her sister Esther after her husband, Aaron Sr., died. In 1764, she married Jaleel Woodbridge, the brother of Timothy Woodbridge, head of Stockbridge School, while Jonathan and family served that mission. Timothy Edwards was the sixth child of Jonathan and Sarah, named after his grandfather. Timothy married Rhoda Ogden of Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and served as the Justice of the Peace before moving back to Stockbridge to care for his orphaned nieces and nephews, to serve as Judge of Probate, and as representative to the General Assembly. Timothy served as a colonel in the Revolutionary War and was mentioned in a letter from Philip Schuyler to George Washington, June 17, 1776. He also served as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Susanna married Eleazar Porter Esquire, who served in the Revolutionary War. Her entry in the Edwards Encyclopedia simply reads, "The seventh child of Jonathan and Sarah Pierpont Edwards." She spent part of 1760 in Boston. In 1761, she became the second wife of Eleazar Porter of Hadley, Massachusetts, where he possibly ran a furniture shop. They had 6 children, one of which died in infancy. He died in 1797. In 1764, Eunice married Thomas Pollock III, great-grandson of the founder of New Bern, North Carolina, and descendant of the founder of Bern, Switzerland. After Thomas's death in 1777, Eunice married Robert Hunt, New Bern resident and New Jersey native. Eunice died in New Bern, North Carolina. Jonathan Jr., known as the Younger, or Dr. Edwards, as opposed to his father, President Edwards, graduated from Princeton before studying under Samuel Hopkins and Joseph Bellamy, who were trained by his father. Jr. pastored what is now Whitehaven Church, or United Church in New Haven, from 1769 to 1795, where he left for a parish in Colebrook, Connecticut. In 1799, he moved to Schenectady, New York, to serve as president of Union College. In his ministry, he published several of his father's works and became a public opponent of slavery.
Elizabeth was ill from birth. She most likely lived with her brother Timothy in Stockbridge after Jonathan and Sarah died. She died at age 15.
Pierpont was 8 when his father Jonathan died, but continued on to serve in the Army during the American Revolution. He was a private practice lawyer who served 5 terms in the state legislature, as well as a delegate to the Continental Congress that ratified the Constitution. Furthermore, he was nominated by Jefferson as a federal judge, where he served until his death. Pierpont's son, Henry Edwards, was governor of Connecticut, and daughter Hannah married inventor Eli Whitney. Pierpont was one of the founders of the Freemasons in Connecticut.
So what can we learn about Sarah through her children? We know she was a diligent mother, graceful and frugal. Her domestic administration allowed her husband to become not only an eminent thinker, but a resourceful father, leading his family spiritually. While her marriage to Jonathan may have been difficult, their affection was always expressed in deep, vivid language. This allowed Jonathan to transcend the position of intellectual to become one of the greatest practitioners of his own theology, beginning with his marriage and his family. Thank you for joining us as we explored Edward's marriage. And I hope you'll join us next week when we explore the difficult question of Edward's participation in the practice of slavery. Thank you.